we're going to get started talking about transportation in the mission. So, what's transportation? What does that word mean? It's ways to get around. In your life, what are typical ways that you use to get from place to place? Can you shout out any or type in any answers? How do you get to a park or around your neighborhood, or maybe in a distant past you got to school some way or another? Maybe you ride buses or cars. Maybe you ride a bike. Maybe you walk. What did it look like in California before the Spanish arrived for the traditional lifeways of the local indigenous people? Let's think about that. They weren't riding cars, right? And they weren't taking buses. And this comes as a surprise to many people that they weren't riding horses. So when we talk about horses, we're talking about animals that came with the Spanish and are only around here in California after Spanish contact. But Ohlone people were able to get around nevertheless. They were walking from place to place, and sometimes really far. They were great walkers, great runners. They could get through their territory and from place to place in the region for trade and communication between tribes as well. And they also had another form of transportation. And in these pictures, we can see a typical tule boat or tule canoe. So these are made out of reeds that come out of the wetlands and sloughs and lakes. They're really lightweight, they're waterproof, they're filled with holes, which means they're filled with air, and they're great floating devices. And a bunch of those reeds tied together properly made a tule boat that was sometimes used to transport people. 1 or 2 or 3 people could be in a tule boat traveling around from place to place. And they were also often used for hunting or fishing. And in the sloughs and the ponds, people could hunt for ducks or they could get fish. These boats are pretty small. They would be in the sheltered bay or on a pond or lake, but you wouldn't see them out in the open ocean. They're not built for that. These ways of transportation were the ways that people got around, but when the Spanish came and settled the missions, life changed. The Spanish brought other forms of transportation with them when they came. Of course, they arrived by ship, and those were sent by the Spanish crown. Let's talk about mission economy for a minute, because when the Spanish established the mission, the crown wasn't very rich. The government of Spain, the king, didn't have a lot of extra money. And so the idea that they established was that the missions were supposed to be self-sufficient. Self-sufficient means that everything that the mission community needed to be produced there at the mission. All the food and the clothing, the buildings and the tools that people needed, to the extent that they could, they wanted to make that inside of the mission. And the Padres were not supposed to be trading with foreigners who came to the shores, because they wanted that economy and any goods that were produced to stay inside Alta California, the 14th colony. If a mission produced some extra goods, maybe they had some more fanegas of wheat than the community would be eating that year, or maybe the cobbler had produced extra pairs of boots. Here's what the Padres could do. They could send that to a presidio. So here we have a map of the California missions. Here is the Santa Cruz mission, and if we had extra goods, we could send that with the next ship, perhaps up to the presidio at San Francisco. We wouldn't get money or cash in return, but we would get a receipt, and the Padre could take that chit or that receipt and make up their grocery list, a list of things that couldn't be produced here in the mission. That might include glass bottles, a bell for the church, icons, candlesticks made out of silver, ceramics, or fancy material, or chocolate. All of these kinds of things would be on the list, and that list would go to the customs house, which was in Mexico in San Blas. Way down south, below our map, below San Diego and inland from Baja. 2 times a year, a ship left San Blas and traveled up the coast from mission to mission, delivering those goods. At least that was the theory. Those ships didn't always leave twice a year, and sometimes they never made it to the destination. They sank along the way. You might also notice that some of these missions aren't along the coast. They're further inland. So how did goods get to those places? Not to worry, there were other forms of transportation besides ships that the Spanish brought. Let's start with the type of transportation that would use tools like this. Perhaps you recognize this from one of our earlier live casts. Do you remember what it is? It is a rope, actually a lead, made out of horse's hair, and it's got a bit, a bridle on the end of it to lead a horse around. So horses were an important form of transportation. And some of the tools were made out of this or out of leather. And here we have another piece that was used with horses. A wonderful state parks docent, thank you, John Grafton. He made this for us, very much like a blacksmith would have forged a bit like this for horses during the mission era. And so a lot of effort went into making tools and accessories out of leather, out of horsehair, out of metal, to use horses as transportation. By the way, they were making bits out of metal, but they weren't making a lot of horseshoes. It turns out that in those days, because the paths weren't paved, they were pretty soft, the hooves of the horse were fine without shoes upon them. So horses were sometimes used as pack animals, and we can see a picture of that over here. We can see large leather casings that were used to cover all the goods that might be transported. And in this place, this animal is having a difficult time with the heavy load. Mules can carry quite a heavy load. They're very strong animals, and so mules were often packed up with goods, including even big stone metates on their backs. Sometimes the mules went in long caravans to take goods from one mission, one place in California, to another. Horses were also used as transportation for communication. This is a picture by David Rickman, and if you have a chance to get one of his coloring books in your hand, they are really valuable resources. He's a historian as well as a wonderful artist, so his depictions of the missions and life in the missions have a lot of authentic detail. And in this picture we see a soldier who's leaving a mission, and he's going to take communication, a message, to the next mission. The missions were built about 30 miles apart from each other in a chain. And that was on purpose so that it would be 1 day's horse ride or 3 days walking from one mission to the next. The horses for the communication worked in kind of a relay system, sort of a predecessor of a system that was later the Pony Express during the American period. Let's remember that California native people also were skilled horsemen who were taught by the Spanish, so they were using this means of transportation also during the mission era. Let's look at that chain of missions. From south in San Diego all the way up to Sonoma. Do you know how many missions there were in the Alta California mission system? There were 21 missions. Know how many presidios? There were 4 forts or presidios, and they were connected by a road. Now, when the Spanish arrived and they started riding their horses and their mule caravans, they were using trails that had been developed over time by California peoples who were traveling within their territory to get resources, or between tribes for communication and for trade. The Spanish reused those trails, and with the addition of all the hooves of the animals, these trails were getting wider and more compact until they essentially became roads. The main road that connected the chain of missions, we can see the green line on this map, was known as the El Camino Real, the Royal Road, or often called the King's Highway. And that's still an important road here in California today. Much of it is the 101, starting in San Diego. So they were all connected by roads and trails. They were used by mules. They were used by horses. There was another form of transportation, and this time we're talking about a vehicle. Let me show you a clue. So, what does it look like to you? It's a wheel. It's different than the wheels on our cars today, a lot different. This one doesn't have anything soft on the edges at all, nothing that's going to move with the bumps in the road. This is a wooden wheel, and it was part of a cart called a carreta. And these carretas were carts, two-wheeled carts that were famous for delivery systems in California. Paul is going to show you a couple of pictures of carretas, and I will be back in a moment. So we can see a basic carreta design, and I actually have a model to show you as well. If I hold it up here.
For the back. There you go.
This is pretty simple version. You can see even the wheels that we have are fancier. But the posts, these aren't made out of logs so much as, out of lumber, so much as logs of different size. And they would be bound together with that material that we keep hearing about it again and again. It is the rawhide strips. And attached to the cart itself, with one wheel on each side, is a yoke, and so animals would be on this side. Usually those were oxen, which are male cattle that are really strong. And so they would be able to pull this. This would transport hides around from the slaughtering site, perhaps to a ship. These would also so they would transport goods. They would also transport people. And here is a picture that shows people being taken. Maybe they're taken out to a more remote outpost of the mission or a work site, or from one mission to the next. People could be transported in these carretas. And here is a carreta being pulled by a couple of oxen with a yoke. So we get to see a picture like that. So this was a very common form of transportation here in California. The Padres took a lot of notes, and they kept a very detailed records of the amount of goods that they had in their missions. In 1806, they wrote that there were 3,200 mares and their young in the herd, that there were 104 broken horses, and that means, broken means that they were trained to be ridden. And there were 12 broken mules and 8 unbroken mules here at the Santa Cruz mission. There were a lot of livestock, a lot of horses that were used. Those cows or cattle that might be used with the carreta were also pretty common, and there were a lot of cows in the California missions. We had a number of them here, and 36 that were used for farming or pulling carretas. think about the carreta being used to take people from place to place. Let's remember that a mission seems like a frontier outpost. It seems like it's very remote in California, and in a way that was true. But the horses, the mules, the carretas, the riders, the ships, all these forms of transportation kept them connected. And that was true for California Native people too. They were not allowed to leave a mission, but what that meant was they couldn't leave and stay away. They actually came and went from the mission center of activity pretty often. It was a permeable membrane. So people were going out to the far reaches of the vast mission lands to do work or to be with other family members out there. People were going from one mission to another and visiting other missions pretty frequently. People also went back to their village site for weeks every year. They got paseos and went hunting. They went fishing. So people were coming and going quite a bit to and from the missions using these different forms of transportation. All right, hopefully that gives us some insight into how transportation was a part of mission history. But we don't want to forget that as well as all those other things, there were also ships. The ships that were supposed to come twice a year. And here's a picture that shows ships in the San Francisco harbor. The reality is that those ships didn't always come twice a year. Sometimes they didn't make their destination, sometimes they sank. The Padres did turn to the thing that they weren't supposed to do. They did trade with any ship that came to port, especially after the Mexican Revolution began and all the Spanish ships were being used in the war effort. So the Padres start trading, and how do we get goods down to the ship? Let me show you one more nifty artifact that we can think about in terms of goods being moved around in California. So this is up on its side, but you have to imagine that this part and this part are level and that they're being held on shoulders. So one person walking in the front, one person walking in the back can hold this kind of a basket and hold lots of goods, because our shoulders are pretty strong. Here we're holding some goods in burlap sacks, and during the mission times, the Padres found that it was the hides and the animal fat, the tallow, that were really important commodities. They shipped a lot of it out of California on those ships, and it ended up going all around the world. So the sailing ships were also an important factor in transportation in Alta California. Well, I hope you have some insights about life in Alta California and how transportation with goods, people, communication around the colony, using foot traffic, using mules and horses, using carretas, using tools like this, and using ships. And we will see you next time for more about daily life in the